welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be comparing my watercolor papers and give my recommendations as to the best brands and my sort of PSAs in terms of brands I wouldn't necessarily recommend. Now, most of the papers that I'm going to be talking about are hot press watercolor paper, but a couple of them are cold press. I know hot press isn't the most popular type of watercolor paper, but for anyone that's looking for a smoother type of watercolor paper and what brands to search for in terms of that, this might be the video for you. Starting off with one of my current favorites right now, this is the Strathmore 500 series ready cut watercolor paper. It's cold press watercolor paper, and as you can see, it's very bright in terms of how the colors turn out. Now, typically I really don't like cold press watercolor paper personally in terms of my style, but for cold press watercolor paper, this is actually pretty smooth. It looks very textured, and it is, but in terms of if you're used to like hot press watercolor paper, you want a smoother one that's going to be good for your like fine detail work with pencil or a fine tip pen. I definitely suggest this for pen, not necessarily pencil if you want to do like a whole lot of detail work with like a colored pencil or a regular graphite pencil, but if you're going to use like a fine tip mechanical pencil or pen, I would definitely suggest this one. I didn't have any issues in terms of skipping or anything. Now, one of the things is, as I said, it's ready cut watercolor paper, so it's pre-cut. It doesn't come in anything that gums it down or anything. I think it was literally just like covered in plastic and had a small piece of cardboard on the back, and that was just the entirety of the packaging. So it's not the greatest in terms of like a portable set or like pad where you can just like pack it in your bag and do anything. But in terms of like studio work, if you want to do swatches or just like a complete illustration, I would definitely suggest this paper. The graded washes are really easy with this paper, as well as the flat washes. That's essential to me in terms of making sure that it can do even the easiest techniques right off the bat whenever I'm trying to get a new watercolor paper. Now I'll show another one where I was working with some custom watercolors. So these are granulating watercolors here. If anyone has granulating watercolors and wanted to see how these colors look. Now the granulation is pretty subtle. I think the nice thing for my art that I like is that I'm not big on granulating colors, so it's not as like really obvious in comparison to my non-granulating colors that these colors granulate on this paper. So that might suck for people that really love granulating colors, but it actually blooms pretty nicely in my opinion, and you see a little bit of that texturization that's happening. And then if you're interested in metallic watercolors, I use two different sets here. I like comparing these between my hot press watercolor papers because sometimes they don't really lay right. Like they'll sort of lay just on top of a watercolor paper versus it actually like sinking in. And what I really like about this one is that it like really nicely absorbs it so that it's more even in terms of the distribution, so that it looks really nice and pigmented, but it doesn't look like it's just laying on top of the paper. It's like this whole separate layer. Again, it's a little bit harder typically with like watercolors that are metallic or that are supposed to be like specifically just used as a metallic highlight or anything in terms of getting like a graded wash, but I would say that this was actually not too bad in terms of that. Despite it being like ready cut watercolor paper that isn't like gummed down or anything like any of those like block types where it's gummed down at the sides that it lays flat while you're working on and then you can peel it off, I haven't had to tape down any of these. There's like the slightest bit, if you see like the slightest bit there of warping, but it's sturdy enough where you don't really need to tape it down and have any issue. Like, unless they really show you on the side, there's not really a whole lot of warping there. If you're really dead set on having like super flat paper after it's done, literally just put a heavy book on top of it for a day or two and it'll be right as rain, perfectly back to normal. This was a pack of 25 sheets for the size here is 5x7. They also come in 8x10 and 11x14. The biggest thing though is the quantity you're going to get depending on the size. So the packs I've seen where it's 8x10 for this paper, you only get about 10 sheets. 5x7 is the best in terms of quantity because you get 25. And then the bigger ones like 11x14, you're only going to get 6, which sucks if you're trying to get stuff in terms of bulk. However, I'd say price-wise, I've seen it between $12 to $20 for these, and on Blick right now, you can get literally this pack for the same price as the 8x10 or the 11x14 for those specific sizes. So if you want to get a pack of 5x7s and a pack of 8x10s, you'll pay the same price for the 5x7 and the 8x10, instead of it being like significantly higher for the 8x10 right now. So I haven't used gouache or acrylic on these, but I definitely would recommend it if you have like a nicer acrylic. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for like the Hemi gouache or like a really cheap gouache brand, but if you're using like tube gouaches like Holbein or something, I would definitely recommend it. It has a really nice, sturdy, like, despite being pretty thin paper for watercolor paper, it's definitely got a nice sturdiness. The texture is really nice, and it would look really nice with a thicker paint medium. And it definitely holds up water well. It's also very fast drying, and another big plus for me is that it actually also comes in hot press. I have not personally tried their hot press, but given how nice their cold press is, I would be very interested in trying the hot press as well. I don't really feel too much of a need to get the hot press though, even though I really love smooth watercolor paper because of just how nicely this cold press works for me. So the next one is the Legion Stonehenge hot press watercolor paper. I unfortunately don't have too many other examples for this one, so I'm gonna show the swatches I did for the Shinhan watercolors that I got right out of the tube. Now personally with Shinhan watercolors, I would recommend that you take them like straight out of the tube and put them in a palette, let them dry first before you go swatching them. So if there's any real inconsistencies with it, it's not an issue with the paper, it's just an issue with the paint here. Colors are very vibrant, very pigmented, and the gradients are pretty smooth on this paper. I really didn't have any issues in terms of making like flat washes or anything. It takes a little bit more effort, I would say, than say the Strathmore here with creating gradients that are really smooth. As you can see with some of them, it took a little bit more work, but it's really dependent on the pigmentation and translucency of your watercolor paint. Like certain pigments where it's like, this one's a bit more of a transparent one, where there's not quite as much pigment. When you're starting with the building up of a lot of pigment and then you're watering it down, you have to be a little bit more attentive when making the flat wash versus say the really pigmented vermilion here, which right out of the tube, it's at its like most pigmented form, and it's gonna take a little more water to actually dilute the pigmentation. Now this one runs for this size currently for $20. For the lowest size for this one, it currently runs for like $20 on Blick. This one's a little bit pricier. It comes in 15 sheets for, I believe, each size. So it's not necessarily the cheapest option, but for hot press watercolor paper, I would definitely recommend it in terms of if you're looking for like a higher quality option and you want to do studio work where you're doing a more finished piece. It's gummed down on two sides here, which I have a bit of a qualm with personally, just because you know, if you're working like straight to the edge and you're not really taping off all the edges, it can easily just like seep into the other ones. I had an issue with that with my last block that had it only gummed down on two sides. So it's just a matter of personal choice if you want to work with it straight up in the block to keep it nice and flat, or if you want to just take it out with a palette knife and then tape it down to your surface, no issue. It's just a note I want to make if you want to work straight up in the block. Now, in comparison to like the other hot press ones that I'm going to talk about, this isn't necessarily my absolute favorite, but it's definitely higher up there. I would definitely buy it again. I just kind of wish it was a little bit cheaper, or at least came with a little bit more paper. So next up is one that I completely and utterly despise. That might be a little surprising given the brand and all, if you've tried their cold press watercolor paper, but I'm gonna explain. If you've tried their cold press watercolor paper, I've heard tons of great reviews about that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of cold press watercolor paper because again, the texture, that's just not really my thing. I do a lot of stuff in terms of pen and pencil illustration as well as watercolor usage. So I need paper that isn't gonna be too textured to the point that it's gonna be very difficult for me to do my illustrative part of my piece. Now, my biggest qualm is not an issue with the texture. In fact, it's actually pretty smooth. There's still a little bit of texture there. It's a nice grippiness, I would say. The texture is really the only saving grace here for me. The colors are very vibrant. That's not the issue. My biggest issue is in terms of techniques here. it's very difficult to actually make a smooth wash in terms of graded washes. A flat wash is not the biggest issue here, but graded washes, not easy whatsoever. It took so much work just to make some of these even remotely nice. And if it can't really do the most basic techniques in terms of flat washes and graded washes, it's going to be really aggravating in terms of doing any type of finished piece with it. I personally cannot even remotely recommend this paper to anybody. The other issue I had is this is a block type paper. What was very nice about it in terms of it being a block type was that it was gummed on all sides, but as you can see, it doesn't actually stick together, which defeats the entire purpose of the block. My other qualm with it was no matter what type of tape I used, it constantly tore up the paper because one, it's much more textured, so it's just going to completely destroy that texture if you put any type of tape on it. If you tape it down, take it off the block, want to tape it off for a smaller area and then not paint on the other. Regardless, like literally if you're going to use tape on this one, it will be absolutely destroyed. It cannot handle any type of tape, even the most like lovely, delicate washi tape. It is abhorrent. I hate this paper. Sorry, I'm typically not like this negative in terms of supplies, but I feel very strongly against this one, especially because of the price, because this one currently ranges between like $20 to $40. It's considered a very high-end professional watercolor paper, and it just does not act like one. Okay, as a point of reference, this is a 7x10 watercolor paper. It's got 20 sheets. I've got this one here that's 9x12, 24 sheets. You're getting more paper. This one here costs between $8 to $10. This one here costs between $20 to $40, and I hate it so much. You're gonna get a lot more of your money's worth with this paper than you are with the quote-unquote more professional paper. This is the Artist Loft one. It's literally the Michaels brand watercolor paper, and it's cold press, but it's still smoother than that one. You could literally use this one and act like it's hot press watercolor paper. It's smooth enough for that, whereas this one is just garbage. I hate it. I've just never really hated an art supply this much before, and this is my PSA. Please don't buy this one if you're looking for hot press one. If you've heard the cold press is really good, it's just not good. It's not. I really can't recommend it to anybody. I'm sorry. Okay, so next up, I kind of teased it a second ago, is the Artist Loft watercolor paper. It's cold press. It comes in two different sizes here, the 9x12 or the 6x9. Now I'm going to show swatches from the 6x9. The paper is pretty smooth. There's a little bit of texture. For a cold press watercolor paper, this is really, really smooth. Again, I'm not a big fan of texture, so I try to look for like the smoothest watercolor paper I can, because hot press is harder to find, especially in your average like art supply and craft store. They are either more expensive or there's just so many less brands that sell it, because cold press is just the more popular choice typically, so not as many stores really sell it. You kind of have to hunt for them. So these are a bunch of custom watercolors that I've got, these are a bunch of handmade watercolors that I've gotten. I want to highlight the metallic ones in particular here for a second. As you can see, they're very pigmented, very shiny, but they kind of lay literally just like on top of the paper instead of actually sinking into it. And because of that, I think that there's a bit of a communication error in terms of actually getting like a nice smooth gradation. That's not my biggest issue though, because personally when I'm using metallic watercolors, I want it with the full opacity. So having this cool, like it's literally metal on top of the paper, is kind of a positive for me. But to each their own. I wanted to point that out for anyone that likes metallic watercolor paper, especially if you have like the Fine Tech ones or the Kuretake Starry Night set. If you have any of those like specifically metallic, like gold, silver, bronze colored ones, and you want to see how they react on certain papers, I wanted to share these. Now, as you can see, the colors are really bright. I would definitely compare this one to the Strathmore one. I use these all the time in terms of swatching out new colors. That's what I did here. I can't really say anything bad about this paper, I'm gonna be honest, especially in terms of the price range. Like it's $8 to $10 at Michaels, and because it's their brand, they tend to have sales on it, or you can get it considerably cheap if you buy in bulk. If you really like this paper and you want to get a whole bunch to either do swatches with or to just practice techniques on, I would definitely recommend this paper. So a fair amount of paper, and it's a pad paper, so it's gonna stay in this pad unless you take it out. I don't have any issues in terms of actually taking it out, in terms of damaging the paper or anything. It's safely gummed in there. I haven't had issues with it like just randomly falling out. You can work just right in it if you really want to, but I wouldn't recommend using it just straight up like a sketchbook, because again, it's built to just like that, take the paper out. So the biggest thing in terms of it would be, I mean, its usage is really just for taking paper out and then working on it separately for a finished illustration. But if you're just using it for like on the go and you want to do like a couple of sketches and you want to be able to take them out, if you're doing like plein air or like travel sketches of landscapes or whatever, you want to take it with you, this is a very portable size. You can literally just like throw this into your carry-on, into your backpack or whatever, and then bam, you have really nice watercolor paper if you want to do a more finished piece while you're on the go. I would also definitely like recommend this one even for like studio artists, because again, I honestly think this is good enough to use for a finished piece, especially if you're just learning. Weight wise, it's not very thick, but it's thick enough where it's going to be able to hold water, it's going to be able to hold layers. In terms of granulating watercolors, this could either be a pro or a con depending on how you feel about them, but with this paper in particular, the granulating watercolors pretty much just start looking like regular watercolors with very minimal texture or any of that nice blooming that you might like from a granulating watercolor where you see all the different colors. You're not really going to see this with this one. If you don't like granulating watercolors, great. If you have a granulating watercolor that you love the color but you don't like how it performs next to your non-granulating watercolors, I suggest this one. If you do like granulating watercolors and you want it to be super expressive, really bloom, I wouldn't really suggest this one, I'm sorry. So yeah, especially if you're a beginner and you're looking for a quality paper that isn't like the regular like big blue Canson XL watercolor paper, I despise that one as well. I would definitely recommend this brand if you're looking for something affordable with a fair amount of paper. If you don't want to just do watercolor sketches and practice techniques, this is good for both techniques and just learning, as well as actually doing a finished piece. Next up is the Fabriano Studio watercolor paper. It's in pad form. This one is the hot pressed version of it. It's 25% cotton. I'm pretty sure all of my other ones are 100% cotton watercolor paper, except for the Artist Loft one. It doesn't specifically give that information. You'd probably have to look that one up. It's probably not, given that it's a cheaper brand. It's a pretty good watercolor paper. It's not my personal favorite, and I'm gonna explain why. So the colors are very bright. It takes a little bit of work in terms of getting a smooth gradient. Again, this is not like necessarily the paper's fault just on this page. I'm gonna show like, this is Kodotake. And then you can see there's a lot of streakiness in terms of getting a nice smooth gradient versus other colors, but it really depends on the color. It's not going to be every single paint that you use that it's going to be super streaky. It just really means that you're going to need to take more time in terms of using a technique like a graded wash if you want it to be very smooth. If that's not an issue for you, then that's not going to be an issue with this paper. My biggest qualm with it though is this sort of pooling effect. The colors are very bright, but as you can see, I was trying to do a color mixing chart in terms of what colors I could achieve by mixing them together with the ones that I have in my custom palette. And as you can see, there's like this very serious pooling effect with most of the colors, or it turns out kind of looking like I put acrylic paint on it in order to try and just avoid this, which ends up just kind of changing the consistency in the color of the paint. So that's not fun for me. I really can't recommend it for that reason, that it has that weird sort of pulling effect. This is my other attempt thinking, oh, maybe my technique is poor. But no, it's really not the case. There was just not this smooth, nice look to the paper. It's like it's sitting on top of it. Sort of like how I showed with the metallic watercolor paper, it kind of just sits on top of the paper instead of actually blends into it. And that's just not super fun for me. So I can't really recommend it if you want your watercolors to look consistent all throughout the piece and you don't want to be frustrated by it. Now, this is a more affordable one, I would say. I got this one for sale at an art store for $10, but the usual price currently is typically around like $10 to $15. It comes with 50 pages, so I'm bummed that I don't like the paper so much. Like, it would be such a great deal if it worked better. So I'm just kind of bummed. I'd probably set this in the category with the arches, where I just really wouldn't buy this again. So the last two ones that I'm going to talk about are the hot press fluid watercolor block. This is in size 9x12. It's a block one again, and this is the one I was talking about where I had a bit of an issue in terms of it being gummed down on two sides, so I'm going to show here. If you paint directly on it and you do not tape it all off on all the sides, because it's only gummed on two sides, it can very easily just seep into the sides of your paper and then just completely dye the page under it, as you can see here, which this is very pretty, but now I'm gonna have to do something completely different on the next page. And the rest of the pages here are warped a little bit and, you know, stained forever. So that's just my own personal little PSA. If you're using a block watercolor paper, if it's only gummed on two sides, please be careful in terms of thinking about what could possibly happen if you use it directly on top, if you're going to go edge to edge with your paint. I would personally recommend taking a palette knife, taking it out of the block entirely, and then taping it down. This one doesn't really warp a whole lot. Again, if you put a heavy book on top of it when it's done, it'll go back to laying flat. That's typical with most papers. So that's not the biggest deal for me in terms of, that's just an issue personally with this one, where I can't really use this one now for anything that I'm going to sell. If I'm going to use any sort of paper at this size, I would have to use a different brand. Now, as for how paint looks on it, very happy with it. The colors are very bright. Again, this is a mix of Daniel Smith and Shinhan watercolors, so they're typically going to look pretty nice and vibrant, but this is definitely one of my favorite papers to use in terms of showcasing how beautiful these colors can look. Any sort of like smooth gradient, it takes a little bit of effort with in terms of this paper. It is very, very smooth, and as you can see, I like to use pen on it. It's great in terms of pen, pencil, colored pencil, watercolor pencil. I would definitely recommend it for that type of like nice, smooth, illustrative element. I would definitely recommend it if you use like any type of drawing mediums as well as watercolors. If you're looking for something akin to like mixed media paper, where it's going to be smooth enough to work on but sturdy enough where you can use watercolors on it. Yeah, it takes a little bit more effort to have a nice smooth graded wash, but the flat washes are beautiful on this. They're very easy to have a nice flat wash. It's just, again, depending on some colors, more transparent colors are going to be easier to make a nice smooth gradient, whereas more heavily pigmented ones, like these ones here by Daniel Smith, they're going to be a little bit more streaky when trying to make a gradient. As you can see here, I did that gold watercolor again. This one is more of a type that actually seeps into the paper, but it's very nice. If you want to do it with full opacity, I would recommend it if you're using metallics. If you're going to do something that's more illustrative and you're trying to find something sort of akin to a mixed media paper that you want to work with in the studio, then I would definitely suggest this one in terms of working with flat washes of watercolor. If you only do like one very thin layer or a couple of thin layers, it's good in terms of building up layers, but graded washes are just not super smooth. It takes a little more effort. The other thing I'm going to point out is I personally have not used gouache on this one, but I have used acrylic, and I would recommend gouache, and here's why. Now, personally, I wouldn't really recommend like the Himi gouache set or like a really cheap type gouache with this paper, but if you're using the more professional gouache, I would definitely recommend this one. So this is with acrylic. As you can see, there is, again, I did not weigh this one down or anything to be straight. I worked with this one on the pad and then took it off, and it was warped a little bit, but if I just weigh this one down with a book overnight, it'll be fine. This is the one that ended up staining all my pages, as you can see. But it held up really well in terms of layering techniques with a thicker paint. It's a nice sturdy paint, and if you want to use like other mediums, like any of your drawing mediums on top of it, where you're doing a lot of layer work with thick mediums, this is great in terms of both being able to get that heavy body paint while also keeping those illustrative tools like pencils, pens, Posca markers, any type of acrylic paint marker. This stuff is great. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for people that are doing just watercolor, but if you're doing a more mixed media piece, I would recommend this paper. Now, price-wise, the 9x12 is $12, which is pretty affordable. It's currently $26 at Michael's, so I would suggest getting it from another place. Definitely do some comparison shopping in terms of seeing which place is going to sell it at the most affordable price. It's currently $26 for this paper at this size at Michael's, but it's $12 on Blick. So obviously I'm gonna go to Blick and get it from there because I can get 2 of these for the price of 1 at Michael's. Price-wise, I think it's a more affordable one for people that are looking for a more professional grade watercolor paper or mixed media paper to work on, where you want to do mixed media type pieces. But again, if you're just going to do watercolor pieces, I don't think this is the one I'd recommend to you. Now, the final one I'm going to be talking about here today is the Blick Premier brand hot press watercolor paper. As you can see, it's 100% cotton. It is 9x12. It's made in England. It's acid free. It comes in 20 sheets. It's 140 pound paper, pretty sturdy. I'm going to take some of the taking some of the pages out here. Now, this is my personal favorite in terms of any type of studio work watercolor block paper. I only have one qualm with this paper, and it is the block form of this paper. If I got it in sheets, I'm sure I'd be perfectly happy with it. The issue is with the block. So as you can see, these are all separate pieces of paper, but the gummed stuff that they put to stick them all together into block form so that you can take a palette knife and peel them apart, keep them all in there securely. It's gummed on all the sides, which is super nice, which was my issue with the fluid one, that it wasn't gummed on all the sides. But the gum does not come off easily, and by easily, I mean I have not found a way to get it off. If anyone has gotten this type of paper or has gotten a block type watercolor paper and has this sort of issue, please let me know how to remedy it, because I love this paper too much. Now, aside from that, that again is obviously a big negative, but I'm still talking about this one because I really love the quality of the paper. If they can fix this issue, then I can hands down give this a solid 10 out of 10 in terms of paper. As you can see, the colors are very bright, very vibrant. Now, some colors are going to appear a little bit darker on this one, but I'm not too upset about that. That just might mean that you might not have to use quite as much paint in terms of getting that full opacity look. You might want to dilute it a little bit with water, and typically when I see that sort of pattern, that tends to mean that the paper actually holds up water really well, so it's just really absorbing that pigment. As you can see, the graded washes are pretty smooth. Any of the ones that aren't very smooth, it's not the paper, that's just me rushing getting these swatches down. The flat washes, as you can see, are very, very smooth. There is a little bit of texture there, but it's really just a matter of toothiness there. It's very smooth to work on, great with pen, great with pencil, great with colored pencil. If you use watercolor pencils and you want to use it as a pencil or dilute it and use it like a paint, great paper for that. Now, what I consider a huge bonus in terms of this paper is that it doesn't really matter what brand you use. If you use multiple brands of watercolor paper, if you use multiple brands of watercolor paint like I do, where you have different, like completely different brands in your palette, I have a mixture of Daniel Smith and Shinhan pretty much, as well as a mixture of handmade watercolors, metallic watercolors. What's really nice about this paper is that it's going to give that consistent look of it. So these are Schmincke watercolors. They're pretty well known by professional artists as very nice in terms of both giving a student grade and professional grade ones. This is their Hordum, so I believe this is their professional grade watercolors. I did a whole bunch of swatches from their dot card, And as you can see, it looks pretty consistent to say this is the Schmenke, and then these are the Shinhan ones, where you still see that really nice vibrancy. You have the nice flat wash, you have the really nice smooth gradient that you can get. So it's easy to do the easiest techniques on. It's good for layering. It's great if you want to use any sort of like illustrative tool as well. I also would probably recommend this one for gouache or acrylic. I haven't personally used it, but because it has a lot of the nicer qualities of the fluid watercolor paper, I would probably recommend this one in terms of if you're using a more heavy body paint medium. Now, the other qualm that I have with this one, aside from the obvious issue with the gumming, which I got this one a couple years ago, they might have fixed this problem, but I'm gonna look into it, is the price. So I got this one on sale from Blick. I did not pay this price, but currently the cheapest price on Blick for this one is $30, so it is not the cheapest option. But if you're a professional artist and you're looking for a brand to work with, I would recommend this one. But that's if, again, they fix this gumming problem, because obviously if you're going to do anything that is in terms of a professional piece, you don't want to have to cut it down because it isn't properly gummed. This might just be a fluke with mine. I'm gonna buy another one and see if they still have that problem with a more current version of this one. But if you have like a coupon, they do tend to have sales in terms of their stuff, especially if you buy their stuff in bulk. So it isn't the biggest deal for me, but if you're a beginner artist, I can't recommend this one because of the price. I wish I could because of the quality of the paper. I love the paper so much. I have no qualms with the quality of the paper. It's really just the price range and the obvious gumming issue. So yeah, that is all of my watercolor papers. To break it down, my favorite one currently, in terms of both for beginners and professional artists, is, interestingly enough, the Artist Loft cold press watercolor paper. I think it's probably going to be the most available. It's going to be the cheapest one that I've mentioned here, and it's going to be good for both beginners and professionals if you're trying to find something that's a good choice to both learn techniques on and make finished pieces. The one that I would never, ever, ever recommend is the Arches one. No, hell no, no thank you. The Stonehenge one I would definitely recommend. And my personal favorite that I mentioned today is the Strathmore 500 series Ready Cut watercolor paper. This one I would recommend to anyone. You can probably find the smaller sizes of this one in the store. I want to apologize for any sort of like sniffing or sneezing sounds in the background. My dog is here with me today, and she has decided to be very noisy when it comes to her allergies today. So apologies for that. But hands down, my two favorite choices that I'm going to recommend between these two is going to be the Artist Loft and the Strathmore 500 series Ready Cut watercolor paper. This isn't cold press. I'm going to probably go and buy some hot press of it, and then I can do a review if anyone's interested in comparing the two. But I love these two to death. I have no issue with them. Price-wise, the Artist Loft one is the best for both beginners, professionals, etc. The Strathmore one is a little bit harder to find probably. My one friend got this at Michael's in this size, and I can't say that I've seen it in the larger sizes at Michael's, but if you're looking for like a smaller one to do smaller pieces or to do swatch work and learn techniques on, definitely recommend this one. I think she got it for like 12 bucks. Okay, so that's all the paper I've got today. These are my two favorites. All of the papers that I've talked about, I will link in the bottom below, and I will specify which ones are my favorites, which ones please don't ever get ever. I'm looking at you, Arches. I hope this was helpful for anyone that was looking for any new papers to try or a recommendation as to a more professional grade paper or one that's easier to just learn techniques with. And I hope you all have a great day. Bye!